Rebekah, how are you today? Thank you so much for joining us. It would be great just to hear a bit about yourself, what you're doing, and I think what's going to be titillating for loads of people that join this podcast is actually if you let them know where you are, because we're in England. Well, I'm in England, but we know that you're not. So I'd love to hear something about that.
Thanks so much, Carla. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you having me. I'm Rebekah Hayward, the inclusion editor. I am the founder of Inclusion Edit, and I've been doing inclusion work for 7+ years now. I'm in Bermuda. Um, I know, I get that a lot. It's yeah, sunny here. It's lovely here. All the things that you would think. And I am back and forth between the UK and here. So it's always a pleasure just to connect with people around the world doing inclusion work. So really happy to be here. I started as a primary school teacher. Doing inclusion work as well. I was the EDI lead there. And I think I just really felt like being a classroom teacher as well as doing the inclusion work, I wanted more time to do the inclusion work. I found it so impactful, and I'll talk about my personal experiences later as we go into it. But I think that combined with my experience, I just knew I wanted to make inclusion work what I was going to do going forward. So I've had various inclusion roles from that time, working in education, working with organisations, charities, to the Inclusion Edit. And it's been a journey, but I think one thing I've learned more than anything in this work is community matters. It's so important finding other people that are doing the work as well, because it can be hard. It's challenging. There is pushback, but when you know your purpose, you know why you're doing the work, and you meet like-minded people, it drives you to keep going. So here I am today talking with you, someone else doing impactful inclusion work, and I'm really excited for this conversation.
I absolutely love that so much. So we have some things in common there. I also started out working in school. Secondary education was kind of my kind of forte, and it's just so lovely to hear that you're already an EDI lead in your environment, because that wasn't actually something that I don't know if many people know is a given within education spaces. And that was kind of something that I think I came across during COVID and realizing there was a gap there. And more often than not, I hear a lot of people say I was filling a gap there, but for you, you came in with that kind of strong position already. Was that something that was part of your job, or did you find yourself evolving to like, actually, this makes sense to me, and then the role was created for you? I'd love to hear a bit about that.
Yes, it definitely evolved over time. I think as soon as I was in that school, it was clear I had a passion for inclusion. What I was doing with my own class, I would share with the rest of the staff. I found out they weren't celebrating Black History Month, things like that. So I was the one to partner with another teacher to say, let's do it again. Let's do it this year. And, what would that look like? And then conversations with SLT saying, this is what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? And looking at the data. I did a data dive around reading with Black boys, and there were gaps. And I took that to my head teacher. I think it was a process, conversations, data, talking, and the Black Lives Matter movement happened. And I was doing lessons when we were at home for parents about how to have these conversations with their children at age appropriate levels. And I think all of that work combined led to me formally stepping into the role, whereas before I'd been doing the work with no official title. But it was just before the Black Lives Matter movement where I had the title. They called it at the time, BAME data.
Yeah, that changed
analysis,
very quickly, didn't it?
Around
Yes,
that. Yes. It did. Now we don't use that terminology, and then they realized actually a lot more needed to happen. But honestly, once I had the title, I received pushback, and again that was kind of another rock in the backpack that made me think, okay, is this the space for me where I can really take this work to the next level? And I know so many teachers doing EDI work have had that experience, especially being the only one existing in white spaces.
I think it's just so common also to hear a little bit from what you said in your story, is that oftentimes those that find themselves advocating for this space sometimes might be the first or the only in the room. And you just led with just how that kind of evolved, even in the way that you had become that prominent voice for EDI there. This might be an interesting question, but I'd love to hear your kind of take on it. What do you think was the fuel behind the pushback? Because for me, that sounds like, look, this is something that will be culturally engaging. We look like we're, a school that is really taking care of the pastoral needs of our community that we represent in our school. In education space, that sense of belonging is such a big thing, and schools want to feel like belonging environments. Why do you think there was pushback for when you started to advocate for this work in your role?
So all of the things you said are so true, and you would like to think everybody understands the amazing benefits, a sense of belonging. But I think a lot of people actually are late to the game in
Mm,
understanding the benefits of EDI. And if we think around the time of COVID, COVID was a priority, safeguarding for, children when they aren't able to
yeah,
be at school because of COVID. We know EDI is a
yeah,
safeguarding issue and should absolutely be included in that. But it's often very detached and seen as a completely separate thing. We also had a new head at that time, and I think, maybe they came into the role thinking, right, I just need to achieve my priorities, and then, the wider staff's ideas, we can come to
mm,
that later on. I think it was a real mix of things. But you're right, it's very common, which is crazy given the fact that we know children perform better, the school gets better data results, more parents want their children to come to your school, so you have a
yeah,
higher intake. The children feel like they belong, they're flourishing, they're building friendships. The list is endless. But there's definitely a disconnect between SLT leadership understanding that, I think, and then that filtering down the rest of the teachers understanding that, because you do need everybody on board at all
yeah.
levels. Um, and again, just another reason why EDI work is needed from the start, from at school to charities, extracurricular activities, into
Mm,
universities, into
mm.
the workplace. But you're right, it has to start at
and
school.
and and I think that's so important. There is it's everyone has to recognize the connection and the cohesion, no pun intended, of everything to come together, because it's really not an isolated thing. It's not mutually exclusive. They do need to work together somewhat. What does it mean to you? Kind of, you. It sounds like you have been the only one in the room, not for the first time. This is one example, but you continue probably to be the only one in the room, sometimes pushing things forward. How has that experience kind of shaped your understanding of representation and belonging? Because when I hear, many people who maybe fall into, vulnerable or marginalized categories, they don't want to be in a place where they can't see themselves. They don't want to see where there's no room already made or a path has not been created. But oftentimes, I think this is where you and I also come into kind of a lot of alignment. It's like we've had to be. How was that experience kind of shaped your kind of experience in terms of understanding and representation and belonging and what you want to see from that?
Yeah, I think it's hard because it's almost a double-edged sword. The marginalized person shouldn't have to always be the one to speak up
Mm,
and drive change and help other people realize how important that is. Often it's the case, been the case in my case, and like you said, in your case. And I would love for that to change. And I think that's where allyship comes in. That's a huge part. I'm sure we'll get to that later on. But I think in terms of, feeling like you belong, and it's all about confidence, being able to show up authentically, and understanding, once you understand certain concepts like code switching,
mm,
professionalism, understanding that professionalism, I was reading something really great that was saying, the idea of professionalism actually is, it's based on whiteness. White people were the ones that decided professionalism should look how
mhm,
it looks. It was men that, decided this is how it should look. And I think, that's filtered down to, the unprofessionalism of black
mm,
hair and, so many different areas. But I think having that confidence, knowing who you are, understanding the situation that you're walking into, coming into, and honestly, doing your research before you enter a workplace, that's so important. We do so much work around inclusive recruitment and practice. And one thing I always say is if the messaging on the website's not inclusive, if I'm not seeing people that look like me, if I'm not seeing your EDI policies on your website, then I'm not going to want
mm,
to come and work there. So do your due diligence so you don't always end up being the only one, and you don't have to carry that weight on your shoulders, and you don't have to, do the whole fake it till you make
yeah,
it and build
yeah,
up your confidence, because you want to be in an environment where you feel other people are rooting for you and where you can be
yeah,
yourself. So I think instead of us being like, what can we change and do? We need to look at what companies are providing and be selective, honestly, about the spaces we go into. And if you know, it's the only space we know we need to be in to um, move our career forward, then really thinking about what support network do we have? Have you got good family and friends at home? I joined Black Teachers Connect, which was, a networking kind of group. They had events online, in-person meetups. You have to then create your own community because you'll need that support going into that
That's
space.
amazing. But I've got to just listening to what you're saying, and for anyone that's been in your position, I can only imagine that that's a lot of work to keep going on an uphill trajectory. And like you say, like it's building that confidence. I'd love to know, like, how did you find resilience and strength in those moments to keep going? Because you mentioned even from the role that you kind of walked into at your last post in education, you became an EDI lead, but not without obstacle and with pushback. How do you find the resilience and the strength in those moments just to keep going? Like, where did you kind of refuel to keep, fighting the fight for another day? Because
Yeah.
that's not easy to do, especially if you're the one in the room.
No, it's not. I think you have to have your purpose in mind and sometimes you have to give yourself a time limit. Okay, I'm going to be here for this amount of
Mm,
time and get what I need from it and then go to somewhere where I'm valued. Again, I got a mentor. People that look like you have had similar experiences to you, have been there, can share advice, and can help you weigh up your options. Okay, you are going to be in this environment for a certain
mm,
amount of time. How can we manage that? Because even though you are the only one, you don't have to do it on your own. Um, I think that helps to change the
yeah.
mindset. But having a mentor, I found, for one, it was a place to vent and share my experiences as someone who understands. We can have jokes and talk, and I can be like, can you believe this is what happened? But then on a serious note, you can start to build an action plan for yourself. Okay, well, who's your ally? Find an ally at work. Is there one? How are you making those personal connections? And then, let's start to think about your next move. What's the space that you do want to be in? What does that look like? Let's find that and let's have that purpose and that direction of where you want to end up. That can just be a stepping stone. It doesn't have to be the end destination, because who wants to be in an end destination where you're not surrounded by your tribe and, where you feel that you can thrive? Nobody wants that.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. And I think we underestimate the importance of the mentorship thing. I think that's also a mindset you need to get good with, and actually seeking and finding that. It requires you to seek someone else that's a little bit further ahead of you. And like you say, because we don't have all the answers, that journey, I think, is a whole other conversation as well. It's finding, but not just my tribe, but someone that I can look up to and I have the humility to learn from, especially as things with regards to DEI are not straightforward. And, they're kind of, they're evolving all the time. Where do I tap into someone that has character or has some of the fundamental principles that no matter where it's applied to, that's something I can really, really learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually, myself and my husband, about 4 years ago, we created IBR, Increasing Black Representation, which was a mentoring
Amazing.
program. Again, from our own personal experiences. When I did my teacher training at uni, I was maybe one of three teachers of color that were training. And it was in the university that's most known for training teachers. My husband had a similar experience in his line of work. And then we'd had our first years in the workplace thinking, oh my gosh, like this is tough. Why did no one tell me about this? I didn't actually expect to be the only
Yeah.
one, or how do I navigate this conversation? And we met so many university students that were having similar experiences, and they were able to be paired up with someone
Yeah.
else, 4, 5, 6, 10 years down the line. And I was just thinking I would have actually loved to have that experience for myself at the time, before I understood the power of mentorship. And, there's something in maybe knowing what to expect. And this is how this person who had the same challenges navigated it. This is what worked for them. This is what didn't. Just it can help you on your journey, because we need support. Like we said, it's a difficult industry to be in, and being from a marginalized community around people that may not understand the experiences that are faced is also
Yeah, for
difficult.
sure. Can you describe it? It sounds like all of these things have been so kind of pivotal to what has kind of evolved in your life and kind
Mm.
of the roles that you've taken with your active work in DEI. Can you describe the vision and the mission behind how you've got to where you are? You're a founder yourself. And what's the impact you're aiming to achieve with kind of the exploits that you're doing now?
So the inclusion edit is new. I've just started it this year.
Congratulations.
And thank you, which is why it's so great to connect with people like you who and your business partner who are already doing this work. But I think if I go back up until now, previously my work has been I've worked with a lot of schools and charities and young people, and I think my mission always was to work with the people that are supporting these young people to really help them to have a well-rounded experience and to understand their needs, because when we have unmet needs with children, that can stop their development. It can stop them to achieve, to grow into being their best self. And having grown up as the only person of colour in an all-white area, I understand just how great it would have been to have teachers, people, in clubs, etc., understanding what I really needed. And I think it was about driving authentic
Mm,
change and, helping organizations to understand EDI is a long-term journey. It's not a tick box
yeah.
exercise. It's not
No.
a quick fix. And helping them to understand different marginalized communities' experiences, and what they can really truly do to, really develop that sense of belonging and help to support a well-rounded young person. I think now that's me, as I started to work with businesses, companies, and with the inclusion edit, it's really about cultivating that EDI community where we can share actionable edits, and tips and thoughts that really help us to think critically about the work that we want to do. From a consultancy side of things, it's about that, authentic EDI work that is long lasting and making a difference, where we're actually going past just making things equitable and looking at, in the setting you have, how are you removing those
Mm,
barriers? So, diversity, inclusion, equity is so important, but how are we removing the barriers in our own setting? Looking at those inclusive recruitment practices, that's a barrier everybody enters when they first get into a space. Thinking about, those maternity leave policies, thinking about how we're supporting our employees of colour who are disabled, etc. I'm really thinking about looking at that from the ground up rather than those quick fixes, because we know in the long term it will give you better retention.
yeah.
Happiness
Yeah.
scores will be
Yeah.
higher, you'll have people that will want to contribute, your results will be better, etc. So that strategic element as well, helping companies
Yeah.
understand that this is what's at the other side, and this is the way better experience you can give your
Yeah, for sure.
employees. It's better for
Yeah, yeah.
everyone.
I love it.
We
Love it
know.
so much. And if you were, for example, this is a bit of a wild question. It's almost like a lottery question. So I always have fun with these. If you could envision a future where all of these incredible goals were fully realized, what would that world look like to you as a result of the work directly that you are active in doing?
Oh, I feel there's two
Oh, I
stages
like
to
that.
this. The end goal is a world where we don't have to worry about
Yeah,
EDI. It doesn't have to be a conversation. It's so deeply ingrained in society and what we do. That representation is everywhere you look. It's a cohesive society and everyone's collaborating together. Those prejudices and stereotypes are removed because we've all done the work and it's been
yeah,
happening for generations. That is the end goal. That's a world where everybody thrives regardless. I think the first stage to that is really seeing companies, organizations, governments, countries make a commitment to EDI and following that commitment through, and being intentional, not performative about the work, and where we start hearing positive experiences from marginalized people in the world at different levels, and where that's celebrated. You hear sometimes people saying, oh, why do we need Pride Month? Um, the LGBT plus community has already come so far. Why do we need Black History Month? But we still do need it because we're not at that stage yet where celebrating those communities and shining a light on what they do and bring it, that's not so deeply ingrained in our society yet that we can forget the months and the weeks. We still need those things at the moment because we're not there yet. And I hear that argument a lot. But I think, maybe in
Oh
100
goodness.
years, when everything is so organically
Yeah.
happening, maybe we'll be there. But right now, we're
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. Yeah.
How about you?
Good question. I've never asked myself that question, but I love to dish it out, as you can imagine, because I'm in the seat of being the podcast host often. You
I've turned the
have, and
tables.
I'm enjoying it. It's keeping me on the edge of my seat. What does that look like for me? I think I share a lot of what you're saying, particularly about this idea that we both share. We've it's kind of the whole kind of overarching topic of this conversation is about what it's like for those that have kind of been the only one in the room. What I would love to see is like that should
Mm-mm.
not be common anymore. It should be, I think you even alluded to this earlier, that people that are wanting to advocate for change, one another, should be coming from pretty much a diverse space of voices, because,
Yeah,
and whether it's because they are not necessarily representing a voice that is marginalized, that because their voice is there, I think it's the human element. I would love to see humans recognizing the brevity and gravity of what it means to acknowledge a sense of compassion for another human being. And if we come down to it, a lot of our work is based on that. You know, we're not asking people, and I think this is where sometimes there is so much push and pull with the work that we do. It's because, are we asking for equal
mm,
rights, or are we asking for empathy or compassion as the basis of what's fueling the work that we're doing? And I think a lot of people feel like, if that's the case, then does that mean that my personal identity gets lost? And I think that's a good question. What I do feel is like, is there a space to create where people have got an understanding of difference and we're not afraid about it anymore? I would love to see a world whereby the work that we're doing is giving people the safety of, I'm allowed to live according to the convictions of my own understanding, but also that because I've been afforded that in such a privileged way, I can afford to give grace to someone else who shares completely different views or completely different identities to my own. That for me, tough. I acknowledge that it's got to be really tough. I'm asking for, a 4-leaf clover and then some in that concept. But I feel that for me, that's what the work that we do and what I feel that I'm here for, is to see that human empathy experience, bridging across bridges that people never saw themselves crossing, in terms of empathy,
yeah.
understanding, and compassion, but still holding on to true authenticism in themselves. I think that's answered the question.
I can I completely agree with you. And at the Inclusion Edit, we always say it starts with empathy, kindness, and
Yeah.
humanity, which are basic concepts everybody can understand. It's not
Mm,
difficult. And I love that you talked about identity, because the beauty of our identity is what makes us us. We would never want to lose
mm,
that. That is, we're able to celebrate all parts of us and learn from each other because of that. And that brings the cultural richness, it brings the diversity. And that is, when we have a mix of people together, that's when we see the best creativity, the best results, the best ideas, the best learning, and the best empathy. It's like a circle, isn't it? You get back to that empathy and kindness, which really comes from understanding other people's experiences, learning about their
yeah.
identity, what they're going through, which is so powerful. And I think you talked earlier about, being the only one. When you're a child, teenager, growing up, maybe early in your career, you know, it shouldn't always have to be on you to share your experiences, but also you don't always know how to share those experiences. How do you come out and say, actually, I feel uncomfortable about this, or this is happening and I don't like it. I'm not sure about this. This is how I see things. Tell me about how you see things. That language we're not
Yeah.
taught about. Again, brings it back to that, why EDI is so important to start in schools and to be having lessons and circle times and assemblies that open up that conversation, because they're children, they need the support with that language, and even we know adults need the support with the language for those kind of
Yeah, I
conversations.
couldn't agree more. I think that's so important, and I think this kind of segues quite well into my next question from you, who occupies, I think, quite a unique space. You mentioned that you're living in Bermuda, you're connecting with all parts of the world in terms of your work. What have you found in the differences of challenges of people experiencing EDI work in the different parts of the world that you're connecting with? Just across the Atlantic from us is the USA, and we're just seeing there's so much
Yeah,
conversation about how they're trying to dismantle EDI as part of any form of legislation that anyone would have a sense of compulsory adherence to, which for me is concerning. um not to do with the sake of I'm trying to eliminate meritocracy. That's not what I'm doing at all. I think absolutely everybody should be employed, particularly in the workplace or the professional space, based on the merit of their work. But if you've got unconscious bias in an environment, those are the things that are going to be disregarded, so that does need to be addressed. I feel removing that from a legal standpoint really leaves the more vulnerable even more open to unfair kind of treatment in those spaces. And it's an interesting kind of understanding, hearing as to why they feel they need to get rid of it right now. What have you kind of experienced in your kind of reach, and how it is that you're in your communication and in your interactions and collaborations with other people over the world? What else have you seen in terms of the challenges being kind of coming towards, or kind of being faced with those also passionate about EDI?
Yeah. I had a great conversation last week with a woman in EDI who was talking about from America, who's talking about the scaremongering
Yeah.
that's happening. We know what's happening in the political landscape, but what comes with that is that, you know, if you're not in a government job, then you still have, you know, the rights to determine how you do EDI, or, you know, what EDI looks like to you in your company. But because it becomes so politicized, that, you know, level of scaremongering, and if you do this there may be consequences. In actuality, there's no consequences if you don't work for the government or in a
Right.
government job. But it's, you know, that idea she was saying, you know, of being labeled as one of those companies that's, you know, ignoring what the presidency's saying, and, you know, are you too woke, are you going rogue and still following EDI? But she was saying, you know, companies still have to bring it back to what's my purpose, what do I want? And if legally, you know, you're not bound by laws and it's not a governmental job, then you can still take it in the direction that you want to take it. So she was saying there's a lot of discussion about companies being like, no, this is still our purpose. And she was talking about the blurred lines between, you know, because there's a lot of chat about, you know, the wording of things, and, you know, are we allowed to call it EDI? Can we use DEI? Can we use those
Yeah.
acronyms now? But be true to your company's intentions. And that's the great thing about business and ownership. You can take that in the direction that you want to take it. But of course, if you're, you know, in the EDI consultancy, some are seeing less clients wanting to interact, or clients interacting but with a bit of apprehension. I joined a great webinar maybe 2 weeks ago. Some companies are stopping using the acronym EDI altogether, and, you know, using other words to get in to start doing that work. I think, you know, I've had the similar conversation, you know, a few years back around, you know, the term BAME changing now to people of color or marginalized communities, or saying every racialized group individually. Often, you know, I feel that, you know, politicizing or, you know, coming for those terms and words, it's just a distraction from actually doing the work. So it's, again, for them, they're finding community, and talking about what they're seeing and facing, and, you know, working around that. If it means you have to come in with a different in, or focus on culture like you do, or focus on identity, or focus on something else, the end goal is still that we're doing EDI work and making a difference. But for sure, they're seeing that scaremongering there. And I'm also seeing, you know, in certain places, people that are saying, well, you know, our community is just not diverse. It's a, you know, it's an all white area. We don't have any people from the disabled community in our community, so we don't need to do EDI work. Which is wild to me, given most people in the Western world have access to the internet now. But I think that that conversation brings in, you know, the culturally responsive, or culturally diverse. You know, you need to be representing the wider world, even if you don't have a range of diversity in your own community. The people in your community will travel, they'll go into the world. If it's schools, they will go and move into cities, etc., and they will be amongst a diverse group, so they need the tools to be able to thrive in that space. And just because your community is not diverse right now doesn't mean it won't be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, etc. So I think similar arguments, they tend to circle back, but the end goal always is, you know, keep your focus on the purpose. Quickly,
Yeah.
another thought just came to mind. Companies saying that they are scaling back, but actually they're not scaling back. And I think in the UK, that's huge. Companies are saying, "Oh, we're rethinking our policies." And then they release a very similar policy. Maybe the odd wording has changed because you know, maybe they're following what's happening in the US, or they're thinking, "Oh, I don't want the scaremongering to, cloud over my company." So small pivots, but the end goal's still the same. How about you? What have you seen and
To be
found?
honest, it's interesting. I think I don't think we've had as much global reach as yourself. Obviously, you're in Bermuda, you're connecting with, organisations back home in the UK, and you've just seen a lot of trends. I think for us, it's looking at like we in saying that we have had a bit of a global reach. So one of our business partner is originally from Anguilla. She also came to the UK as a teenager, and we've been able to go back and actually work with the Department of Education there and provide some workshops and some kind of enrichment programs. And for them, it's opportunity. Where do we look for opportunity as a nation?
Mm.
And again, back into the identity of belonging. I can go anywhere if I do my part. So that's kind of been where we are, and in our work here in the UK and our connections with the university environments, particularly. So that's the jump just before people are entering into the professional sphere, especially from loads and loads of international kind of demographics who are looking to make a life for themselves, because the world is no longer confined to my nation. People are literally, it's a global village now. You will go to India, or you will go to Sweden, or you will go to Denmark, or you will go to the States if that's where your work and professional life is going to take you. But what we find is the challenge in our work is not just about those elements, but it's about how do I adjust the culture, and culture engagement of people trying to navigate recruitment, how they're trying to navigate belonging when they are applying for roles and making a life for themselves in the country not originally their own. And how do they bridge that gap? And that's a really complex conversation. And it's also, I think, a lot more nuanced when it comes to when I go to an interview. How am I going to come across culturally at home? Being passionate about it and using lots of hand gestures to show you how much I really feel about something. It's not going to necessarily work in a very reserved, conservative, I don't know, village in Scotland. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that links as well to the point about what is professionalism and what does that look like in different areas
100%.
of the
Yeah.
world. Yeah. It's really interesting. I think, I had a fantastic interview with a black woman owner of a business, and it was so relaxed, and I could use some of the words I normally would. My voice could be a little bit louder. I could use my hands. I was smiling a lot. There was and I left thinking, wow, what a fantastic interview. And I've had different interviews, maybe with an all male white panel that are a lot older. And it's very much, I'm going to wait for the questions to be asked to me, reply to them, and
Mm,
that's it. I'm not confident to make a joke if it might feel inappropriate, or, it's me reading what's appropriate in their culture, then, understanding I may be different, or not understanding that actually because there's not a relaxed environment. But maybe that's because that's what professionalism looks like to them. Um, so interesting, but I know for sure when that cultural competence is there, you get the best results. I performed so much better in the interview that I had with the black woman owner, than an interview where you feel all the pressures applied, you can only speak when spoken to, and this is how the setup's going to
mm,
be. And again, it goes back to that inclusive recruitment. It's so important when you're interviewing, if you can have someone that looks like the candidate in the interviewing panel. And if you've done blind recruitment, which is fantastic, that's how it should be done, then just make sure that your panel's diverse. Make sure it's diverse. If you don't have that diversity in your company, like I was a member of Black Teachers Connect. Find someone in a network that works similarly with what you do and ask them, would you sit in on this interview? Would
yeah.
you be a part of this?
Yeah.
Someone from
Yeah.
your board. There's so many different levels where you have the chance to make
Yeah.
things diverse, and it impacts so much on what you get out from your candidate and to be
But like what you
employee.
said, you do have to be intentional about looking for the opportunity to create that environment. Like you said, if it's not
Yeah.
there, what can I do to find, other connections or a wider network to create that environment, to create that culture? And I think that is everybody's business. It's not just the one in the room who's thinking about it. Everybody should be concerned about, are we doing that adequately together? It's beyond a team effort. Rebekah, this has been such an amazing conversation. You've shared so many pearls of wisdom. I've felt like I needed to take notes for everything that you said. And just such a refreshing humility in your approach to the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for being with us today. I've got one more question to ask to wrap it up. Is that, looking back on your journey, what would you tell your younger self about
Mm-hmm.
navigating spaces where you felt underrepresented?
I think know that being in that space isn't going to be forever. You'll push through, you'll develop your confidence during that time, and you will end up in places with other people that look like you, in diverse communities where you can show up as yourself. And I would tell me to find community along the way. I only got switched on to community and networking when I started my first job post university. I didn't know about networking, school, university, even my first few couple of years of my career. I didn't know how powerful that could be. And using the internet to find those networking groups, find that community, and do your research about a workplace before you join. Do your
Love that so much.
research.
Rebekah, thank you so much for just everything that you've shared with us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you, and wishing you all the best with what you're doing and the work that you're doing.